You ever have one of those days where you think, this can't possibly be happening? Well, strap in because my HOA, led by the self-proclaimed queen of our cul-de-sac, managed to find me for fishing. Yes, fishing. In a lake that, for all intents and purposes, felt like it was part of my own backyard. The fine itself wasn't just a slap on the wrist, it was a full-blown, two-handed shove designed to make my blood pressure spike. But here's the kicker, the part that still makes me chuckle. That ridiculous fine set off a chain of events that ended with me owning that very lake and then, oh so sweetly, fining the HOA for trespassing. And believe me, my fine was a whole different ballgame than theirs. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because this story is one for the books. It's about petty tyranny, meticulous planning, and the glorious taste of vindication. This is how a quiet afternoon angling turned into an all-out suburban property war, and how I, your humble narrator, ended up holding all the cards and the deed to the lake. It all started, as these things often do, with a simple pleasure. I'm a civil engineer by trade, spend my days dealing with plans, regulations, and the often frustrating logic of infrastructure. My escape? Fishing. There's a serenity to it, a methodical patience that calms the mind. Our community, Willow Creek Estates, a name far grander than the reality, boasted a picturesque man-made lake. It was one of the main reasons I bought my house there. My property line didn't quite touch the water. There was a strip of common land, maybe 20 feet wide, that ran around it, but my backyard offered a lovely view and easy access. For years I'd fished there. Catch and release, quiet, respectful, never an issue, or so I thought. The HOA, presided over by one Mrs. Braith. Eleanor Ainsworth, though everyone privately, and sometimes not so privately, referred to her as Queen Eleanor, or more bluntly, Karen the Conqueror, had always been a bit zealous. Eleanor was a woman who seemed to derive her life force from enforcing rules, many of which seemed to materialize out of thin air, or at least from the deepest, darkest recesses of her own particular interpretation of the community bylaws. She was in her late 50s, always impeccably, if somewhat severely, dressed, often seen patrolling the neighborhood in a golf cart emblazoned with HOA President in ostentatious gold lettering. Her eyes, scanning for infractions, like a hawk spotting a field mouse. Her silver Mercedes, always gleaming, was another symbol of her perceived status, usually parked just so in her oversized driveway. That fateful Saturday, the sun was mild, a gentle breeze rippled the water, and the fish were biting. I was in my element, a good 100 feet from any other property, minding my own business. Then, the telltale hum of an electric motor. Queen Eleanor, in her chariot of judgment, visor pulled low, a clipboard of destiny clutched in her hand. She pulled up beside me, the golf cart whirring to a stop with an air of finality. "Mr. Henderson," she began, her voice dripping with that particular brand of condescension she reserved for rule breakers, real or imagined. "I trust you're aware of Article 7, Section B, Paragraph 3 of the Willow Creek Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions?" I blinked. I'd read the CC Rupees when I moved in, a dense, sleep-inducing document, but I couldn't recall any specific prohibitions on fishing, especially not for residents. "I can't say that specific paragraph springs to mind, Eleanor," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Is there a problem?" Her lips thinned into a bloodless line. "A problem? Mr. Henderson, unauthorized recreational activity on HOA common property is a serious violation. This lake is for aesthetic enjoyment, not for this." She gestured vaguely at my fishing rod as if it were a medieval weapon. "Aesthetic enjoyment?" I echoed, my incredulity starting to rise. "People have been fishing here for years. There are no signs posted saying otherwise." This was a common refrain when dealing with Eleanor. Rules were often enforced retroactively or based on her mood. "Ignorance of the rules, Mr. Henderson, is not a defense," she sniffed. "The rules clearly state that common areas are for passive enjoyment, unless explicitly permitted for other activities by the board. And the board," she paused for dramatic effect, tapping her pen on the clipboard, "has not permitted fishing." I knew arguing was futile. Her mind was a closed loop. "So what? You're giving me a warning?" I asked, already reeling in my line. "A warning?" She almost laughed, a short, sharp bark. Oh no, Mr. Henderson, this warrants an official citation. You'll receive a notice in the mail, $200. And I expect you to vacate HOA common property immediately. $200 for fishing. In a lake I'd used without issue for half a decade. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. I packed up my gear, a cold knot of anger forming in my stomach. As I walked back to my house, I saw her stop to berate young Timmy Carmichael for riding his scooter too aggressively on the sidewalk. The woman was a menace. The official notice arrived 2 days later, printed on thick, creamy paper that seemed to underscore the seriousness of my transgression. Violation: unauthorized recreational use of common area, fishing. Penalty: $200, due in 15 days. There was also a thinly veiled threat about further legal action and liens on my property if I failed to comply. That night, I pulled out my copy of the CC, Rupees C. I'm used to reading technical documents, deciphering complex codes. I went through it page by page, highlighter in hand. Article 7, Section B, Paragraph 3. It was about landscaping standards for common areas, nothing about recreational use. There was a general clause about the board having authority over common areas, but it was vague, nothing explicitly banning fishing. More importantly, as I scanned the definitions and property descriptions, a question started to form in my mind. Did the HOA actually own the lake? The documents referred to common areas, but the lake itself wasn't clearly defined as one. It was listed on the original development plat, of course, but its specific ownership status within the HOA framework was fuzzy. Most HOAs I knew of either explicitly owned their amenities or had clear usage rights. This was ambiguous. The fine wasn't just an annoyance anymore, it was a challenge. Eleanor had overstepped, I was sure of it, and that $200, it felt like an insult. I wasn't just going to pay it. I was going to find out who really called the shots when it came to that lake. Little did Eleanor know, she hadn't just fined a resident, she'd poked a hornet's nest with an engineer who had a penchant for research and a very, very low tolerance for bullies in golf carts. My weekend project was no longer about organizing the garage. It was about unraveling the truth behind Willow Creek Lake and Queen Eleanor's flimsy reign over it. My first port of call was the county records office. As a civil engineer, I'm no stranger to plat maps, deeds, and property searches. It's tedious work, but the devil, or in this case, the salvation, is often in the details. I started with the original master plat for Willow Creek Estates, filed back in the late 1970s when the development was first conceived. I located my lot, the surrounding lots, and then the parcel designated as Lake. The plat clearly showed it as a distinct parcel, separate from the residential lots and the explicitly designated common area strips that provided pathways and greenbelts. This was interesting. Usually, if an amenity like a lake is intended for HOA ownership and control, it's either deeded directly to the HOA at the time of development, or it's part of a larger common area parcel. This lake, however, had its own parcel number. My next step was to trace the chain of title for that specific parcel. This is where things got really intriguing. The original owner was, of course, Willow Creek Development Corp. I then looked for a transfer of ownership to the Willow Creek Estates HOA. Nothing. No deed, no record of sale, no transfer of any kind. I checked again, cross-referencing dates, names, and legal descriptions. Still nothing. The HOA owned the clubhouse, the little patch of grass they called a park, and the strips of land around the lake, but the lake itself? According to these initial records, it appeared to still be titled to Willow Creek Development Corp. This was a significant find. My engineering mind immediately latched on to the implications. If the HOA didn't own the lake, they had no inherent right to make rules about its use, let alone fine people for fishing in it. Their authority extended only to the land they did own, the shoreline common area. So technically, if I was standing on that common strip while fishing, they could try to make a case for unauthorized activity on common property, but the act of casting into water they didn't own. That was a much murkier area for them. I spent a good chunk of the next week buried in online databases, occasionally making trips back to the county clerk's office to verify physical documents. Willow Creek Development Corp., I discovered, had been dissolved in the early 1990s, a victim of a minor recession and some poor investments. Its assets, theoretically, should have been distributed or sold off. But what happens to a parcel of land, a lake no less, when the corporate owner ceases to exist and there's no clear record of its disposition? This is where things can get complicated. Sometimes such properties revert to the original landowners. Sometimes they can be claimed by the county for unpaid taxes, or sometimes they just sit in a legal limbo, an orphaned asset. I needed to find out who, if anyone, currently held title or could claim it. While I was digging into this, life in Willow Creek Estates went on under Eleanor's watchful eye. I received a second notice for my fishing fine, this one with added bold text and an administrative late fee of $50. The original $200 was now $250. I also heard from my neighbor, old Mr. Henderson, no relation, ironically, that his granddaughter had been sternly warned by Eleanor for leaving her tricycle on the edge of her own driveway for more than the permitted 2 hours. The absurdity was a constant. One evening, while I was poring over tax records for the lake parcel, my friend Dave, a real estate lawyer, dropped by. I laid out what I'd found so far. So, the original developer went bust, and the lake parcel was never formally transferred to the HOA? He asked, intrigued. That's what it looks like. I confirmed. Tax records show property taxes on that specific lake parcel have been erratic, sometimes paid by an unknown entity, sometimes delinquent. Dave whistled. That's a classic orphaned property situation. It's possible no one has clear title, or the title is held by heirs of the defunct company's principals who don't even know they own a lake in Willow Creek. He then explained the concept of adverse possession, but also the more direct route. If the taxes were significantly delinquent, the county might eventually put the parcel up for a tax lien sale. Or, if we could identify any surviving principals or heirs of Willow Creek Development Corp., they might be willing to sell it for a nominal sum just to get it off their books, assuming they were even aware of it. The aha moment came late one Thursday night. I was cross-referencing shareholder names from Willow Creek Development Corp's last known annual report with probate records. One of the minor shareholders, a Mr. Arthur Albright, had passed away in 2005. His estate listed various assets, mostly stocks and bonds, but then, buried in a miscellaneous addendum, was a very vague reference. Residual interest in undeveloped land assets. Willow Creek Development Corp. Dissolved. Value undetermined. Bingo. This was a thread. Arthur Albright had one surviving heir, a daughter named Sarah Albright, who lived several states away. It was a long shot, but if she was the inheritor of this residual interest, she might technically be the current, albeit probably unwitting, owner of the lake. The seed of an idea, a wild, audacious idea, began to sprout. What if I could buy the lake? What if I, an individual, owned the very body of water Eleanor Ainsworth believed was her personal fiefdom? The thought was so deliciously ironic it made me grin. Of course, owning a lake isn't like buying a new fishing rod. There are responsibilities, liability, maintenance, water management, environmental regulations. My civil engineering background actually gave me a decent understanding of these things. I knew about dam safety. It was a small man-made lake with a simple weir, potential dredging needs and water quality. It wouldn't be a casual undertaking. But the prospect of turning the tables on Eleanor and the overreaching HOA was an incredibly powerful motivator. I started doing some preliminary calculations. What would such a parcel even be worth? It generated no income. It was a liability for an absentee owner. It was landlocked by HOA common areas and private properties. To anyone but the residents or the HOA, it was practically worthless. Except, perhaps, to a disgruntled resident with a score to settle and a vision. I decided my next step was to discreetly contact Sarah Albright. If she even knew she owned a lake, she might be thrilled to offload it. The original $200 fine was looking like the best investment I'd never made. Eleanor's campaign of petty tyranny was about to run headfirst into a meticulously researched, legally fortified, and deeply satisfying counteroffensive. The game was afoot, and I was starting to feel like I knew the rules better than she did. Contacting Sarah Albright required a delicate touch. I couldn't exactly call her up and say, "Hi, I think you unknowingly own a lake that my HOA president is being a tyrant about, and I want to buy it to stick it to her." I drafted a polite, professional letter explaining that I was a resident of Willow Creek Estates, had conducted some research into a specific parcel of land integral to our community, the lake, and believe it might be an overlooked asset of her late father's estate. I expressed an interest in discussing its potential acquisition to ensure its continued maintenance and enjoyment by the community, albeit under private ownership. I kept the tone neutral, focusing on stewardship rather than revenge. It was a bit of a gamble. She could ignore it, or her lawyers could tell me to get lost. But a week later I received a call from a very surprised-sounding Miss Albright. "Mr. Henderson?" she began, her voice tinged with curiosity. "I received your letter about a lake? My father owned a lake?" She genuinely had no idea. Her father, she explained, had been a passive investor in many small ventures, and the details of Willow Creek Development Corp. Were lost to time. She was intrigued and, frankly, a little overwhelmed by the prospect of owning and being responsible for a body of water hundreds of miles away. This was exactly the reaction I had hoped for. We spoke for nearly an hour. I explained the situation. The defunct corporation, the unclear title, the fact that the local HOA thought they controlled it but didn't actually own it. I was careful not to paint the HOA in an overly negative light at this stage, merely stating that clarifying ownership would be beneficial for everyone. Sarah was pragmatic. "So, what you're saying," she summarized, "is that I might own this lake, it's potentially a liability, and you're interested in buying it?" "Essentially, yes," I replied. "I live here, I appreciate the lake, and I have the background to understand its management. I'd be prepared to make you a fair offer to take it off your hands, assuming we can clear the title." The next few weeks were a flurry of activity. Sarah, through her local attorney, confirmed her inherited interest in the remnant assets of Willow Creek Development Corp., which indeed included the lake parcel. The title wasn't pristine given the defunct nature of the corporation, but it was clearable. We began negotiations. Because the lake had no income potential for her, was a potential liability, and she had no emotional or practical attachment to it, she wasn't looking to make a fortune. Her main concern was a clean, hassle-free sale. I made an offer that I considered fair, factoring in the costs I would incur for title clearing, legal fees, and future maintenance. It wasn't cheap, certainly more than a few fishing fines, but it was within my means, especially when I considered the immense satisfaction it would bring. I engaged my friend Dave, the real estate lawyer, to handle my side of the transaction. He was thoroughly enjoying the unfolding drama. "You're really going to buy a lake to get back at your HOA president?" He'd chuckled. "It's not just to get back at her, Dave," I'd said, though my grin probably betrayed me. "It's about responsible property management." While all this was happening in the background, with utmost discretion, Queen Eleanor continued her reign. She'd had no trespassing HOA property signs installed along the common area strip by the lake, facing outwards, ironically, towards the water she didn't own. She also sent out a newsletter announcing a new lake beautification initiative, which included plans for a new, larger dock to be built on the edge of my future property, and stricter rules about what kind of unauthorized boats could be used. The dramatic irony was almost painful to witness, but I had to maintain my silence. Any leak of my impending purchase could scuttle the deal, or at the very least drive up the price if the HOA suddenly realized its mistake and tried to acquire it themselves. There were a few close calls. Once, Eleanor spotted me talking to a surveyor I'd discreetly hired to confirm the exact boundaries of the lake parcel. She'd marched over, demanding to know what unauthorized surveying was taking place on HOA land. I mumbled something about checking my own property lines for a fence I was considering, and thankfully, she bought it, though not without a suspicious glare. Finally, the day arrived. All the I's were dotted, the T's crossed, the funds were transferred. Sarah Albright signed the deed, and it was recorded with the county. I, Michael Henderson, ordinary resident and disgruntled fisherman, was now the official sole owner of Willow Creek Lake. I held the certified copy of the deed in my hand, a surprisingly simple document for such a monumental shift in power. The feeling was a potent cocktail of triumph, a touch of, "Oh God, what have I actually done?" and an overwhelming sense of impending satisfaction. My first act as lake owner was nothing. For a week, I did absolutely nothing differently. I let Eleanor and the HOA continue in their blissful ignorance. I watched their landscaping crew mow the grass right up to the water's edge, my water's edge. I saw residents using the old, rickety HOA dock. I even received another automated reminder about my outstanding fishing fine, now with additional interest, threatening referral to a collections agency. Each of these little paper cuts only sweetened the anticipation of what was to come. I wasn't just going to inform them, I was going to present them with a bill. A bill for every unauthorized use of my newly acquired property. My engineering mind was already cataloging every HOA meeting held by the lake, every community day that utilized its shores, every time their security patrol, Eleanor in her golf cart, traversed the perimeter that was now mine to control. The plan wasn't just to stop the fines against me, it was to demonstrate, in the most financially unambiguous way possible, the consequences of their arrogance and incompetence. The quiet before the storm was delicious. Eleanor Ainsworth had no idea that her little kingdom was built on water she didn't own, and the tide was about to turn dramatically. The trigger for my grand reveal came, as expected, from Queen Eleanor herself. It was a crisp Saturday morning, perfect for another round of meticulous rule enforcement. I was in my kitchen, enjoying a cup of coffee, when I saw the official HOA letterhead in my mailbox. My heart gave a little flutter of anticipation. This wasn't another reminder for the original fishing fine, this was a brand new violation notice. Apparently, the small, unobtrusive bird feeder I had in my backyard, visible from the common area if one craned their neck just so, was attracting undesirable wildlife, squirrels, mostly, and was in violation of a newly minted fauna control addendum to the CC, rupees. The fine? Another $100. This was it. The universe, or at least Eleanor, was practically begging me to drop the hammer. That afternoon, I sat down at my computer and began drafting my own official communication. This wasn't going to be an angry email from a resident. This was a formal letter from Michael Henderson, owner, Willow Creek Lake Parcel, number 73 to 4B-881. I attached a certified copy of the recorded deed as Exhibit A. The letter was a masterpiece of polite, legally precise devastation. It began by informing the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association that parcel number 73 to 4B-881, commonly known as Willow Creek Lake, including the lake bed, water volume, and riparian rights extending to the mean high water mark, was now under my private ownership, effective as of the date on the enclosed deed. It went on to state that any prior assumed permissions or access rights the HOA believed it held over the lake were now null and void. The existing HOA dock, any signage they had placed on the land immediately abutting the water, and their routine landscaping activities that encroached onto the lake parcel constituted unauthorized use and trespass upon private property. Then came the beautiful part. I informed them that, as the new owner, I had conducted an audit of the unauthorized use of my property by the HOA and its members dating back to my assumption of ownership. This included, but was not limited to, the continued operation and maintenance of the HOA dock on my property. The HOA-sponsored Spring Fling event, held partially on the lake's edge last weekend, after I took ownership. The daily passage of their security golf cart on the immediate lake perimeter path, which, according to the survey, partially fell within my parcel. And the ongoing aesthetic enjoyment which they so valued, now available via a fee. I then presented Exhibit B, an itemized invoice. I charged a dock encroachment fee, a special event usage fee, a right-of-way access fee for the golf cart, and a general, unauthorized commercial recreational facilitation fee for their effectively representing the lake as an HOA amenity without the owner's consent. I calculated these fees based on what I considered fair market rates for similar private water access and land use, and also added a premium for the unauthorized nature of it. The grand total of my invoice to the Willow Creek Estates HOA, a cool $15,750, payable within 30 days to avoid further legal action and the accrual of interest. I also included a cease and desist demand for all current and future unauthorized activities on my property. I printed it on my own high-quality paper, signed it with a flourish, and sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested, to the HOA office, addressed directly to Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth, President. I also sent copies to each of the other 4 board members. I can only imagine the scene when that letter arrived. I pictured Eleanor, perhaps initially dismissing it as another resident complaint, then her eyes widening as she read the first paragraph, the color draining from her face as she saw the deed, and then utter apoplectic shock when she reached the invoice. The return receipt, signed by a bewildered-looking HOA administrative assistant, arrived 3 days later. The silence from the HOA was deafening for about 24 hours. Then, the tremors started. My phone rang. It was Arthur Jenkins, one of the quieter, more reasonable HOA board members. "Michael," he said, his voice strained. We got your letter, and the invoice. Is this for real? You bought the lake?" "Every drop, Arthur," I replied calmly. "Deed is recorded and perfectly legal." There was a long pause. "Eleanor is, well, she's calling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow night. You should probably be there." "Oh, I wouldn't miss it for the world, Arthur," I said. "I'll bring extra copies of the deed and my surveyor's report on the exact property lines, just in case there's any confusion." The next evening, I walked into the HOA clubhouse meeting room. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Eleanor was at the head of the table, her face a mask of thunderous disbelief. The other board members looked pale and anxious. A few curious residents, alerted by the sudden emergency meeting, milled about. Eleanor began without preamble, her voice tight with fury. "Mr. Henderson, this board finds your recent communication to be outrageous, baseless, and frankly, a malicious attempt to defraud this association." She slammed her hand on the table, a gesture that usually intimidated lesser mortals. I simply smiled. "Mrs. Ainsworth," I began, my voice calm and steady, "there's no fraud involved. There's a legally executed and recorded deed, a copy of which you all received. Parcel number 73-4B, -881, Willow Creek Lake, is my private property." I placed a neat stack of documents in the center of the table. "And as the owner, I am well within my rights to charge for its unauthorized use and to demand that trespassing cease." Eleanor sputtered. "This is HOA common property. It has always been HOA common property. This is some kind of trick." "Actually," I countered, pulling out the original development plat map and my chain of title research, "it was never deeded to the HOA. It remained with the developer, Willow Creek Development Corp., and then passed to Mr. Albright's estate, from whom I purchased it. It's all there in the public record, which, I might add, the HOA board perhaps should have reviewed before making rules and levying fines related to a property it didn't own." 2 of the board members, a mousy woman named Carol and a nervous man named Bill, who were usually Eleanor's staunchest enablers, were now looking at the documents with dawning horror. They were beginning to understand the monumental screw-up Eleanor had presided over. And the invoice for $15,750? Eleanor spat the amount like it was poison. "That's for the period since I took ownership. For the dock, the event, the access. I believe the itemization is quite clear. Or would you like me to go over it line by line?" "Perhaps we can start with the Lake Beautification Initiative you announced, which involves planned construction on my land." The color drained from Eleanor's face. The other board members were silent, staring at the invoice, then at me, then at their rapidly imploding president. The power in the room had shifted so completely, it was almost a physical force. Queen Eleanor was, for the first time since I'd known her, speechless. The hunter had become the hunted, and the lake was my domain. The aftermath of that emergency board meeting was, to put it mildly, chaotic for the HOA. Eleanor Ainsworth's reign of terror had hit a very solid, legally deeded wall. Her attempts to bluster her way through the reality of my ownership quickly crumbled as the other board members, faced with a $15,750 invoice and the undeniable truth of the property records, began to distance themselves from her. The initial reaction from Eleanor was, predictably, denial and threats of legal action against me for disrupting the community. However, after their own hastily consulted attorney took one look at my deed, the surveyor's report pinpointing the encroachments, and the clear history of the parcel, he advised them in no uncertain terms that they were, to use a technical legal term, up a creek without a paddle. a creek that now, ironically, flowed into my lake. Negotiations began, though negotiation is perhaps too generous a term. It was more like a surrender. The HOA had no leverage. They couldn't use the lake, they couldn't access the shoreline in many places without trespassing, their existing dock was an illegal structure on my land, and their grand lake beautification initiative was dead in the water. My initial invoice for $15,750 became the starting point. Their lawyer tried to argue it down, claiming the fees were excessive. My lawyer, Dave, who was enjoying this immensely, simply pointed out that these were fees for unauthorized use, and that continued unauthorized use would accrue further, potentially higher fees. He also gently reminded them of the cost of litigation, which they would almost certainly lose. The downfall of Queen Eleanor was swift and brutal. At the next regular HOA meeting, which was packed with curious and increasingly disgruntled residents who had heard whispers of the debacle, a vote of no confidence was called. Arthur Jenkins, the board member who had first called me, led the charge. He laid out the facts. The HOA had never owned the lake. The board, primarily Eleanor, had overstepped its authority for years, exposed the HOA to significant financial liability, and had alienated a resident to the point where he bought the central amenity out from under them. Eleanor tried to defend herself, blaming deceptive practices by me and lack of support from the board, but her credibility was shot. She was voted out as president and off the board entirely by an overwhelming margin. It was a quiet, almost anticlimactic end to her tyrannical rule, but deeply satisfying to witness. The new HOA board, now led by a much more reasonable and humbled Arthur Jenkins, approached me with a far more conciliatory tone. They acknowledged my ownership and the validity of my claims. We eventually reached a settlement. The HOA agreed to pay $12,500 to settle the initial invoice for unauthorized use. This more than covered my original $200 fishing fine, my legal fees, the cost of the survey, and a nice chunk of what I paid Sarah Albright for the lake itself. They also formally agreed to remove their dock from my property at their expense, and to cease all landscaping activities that encroached beyond their actual common area boundaries. As for the lake itself, I had a few options. I could have made it entirely private, a monument to my victory, but that felt a bit too much like Eleanor's style. Instead, after a period of enjoying some very quiet, peaceful fishing entirely by myself, I approached the new HOA board with a proposal. I would grant a formal, revocable license agreement to the HOA for resident access to the lake for specific, mutually agreed-upon recreational activities, fishing, catch and release only, proper licenses required, kayaking, and passive enjoyment. In return, the HOA would pay a modest annual license fee, which would go towards the lake's upkeep, which I now managed, with a focus on ecological health rather than just aesthetic enjoyment. And they would agree to a strict set of rules drafted by me, enforced by me. No more arbitrary fines from the HOA related to the lake. All signage would clearly state private property, access by HOA license agreement. The broader impact on Willow Creek Estates was noticeable. The HOA, under new leadership, became far less adversarial. They started focusing on actual community improvements rather than petty rule enforcement. Property values, which some had feared might drop if the lake became inaccessible, actually remained stable, perhaps even improved slightly due to the more harmonious community atmosphere. Residents were generally relieved that Eleanor's reign was over, and many privately thanked me for what I'd done. My personal satisfaction was immense. It wasn't just about the money or the ownership, it was about standing up to a bully, using logic and due diligence to dismantle an unjust system. It was about the principle, and yes, the fishing. I now fish on my lake whenever I please. Sometimes Arthur Jenkins joins me. We rarely talk about the old days of Queen Eleanor, but there's an understanding that passes between us. The water is calm, the fish are biting, and there's not an HOA golf cart in sight. So, what started as a ridiculous $200 fine for fishing ended with me owning the lake, the HOA footing a hefty bill, and a much-needed change in community governance. Never underestimate someone who's been pushed too far, especially if they're willing to do their homework and aren't afraid to think big. What's the craziest HOA encounter you've ever had? I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you enjoyed this tale of property lines and poetic justice, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, because you never know what story I'll be sharing next.